Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President, and today I'd like to speak about jobs. I've been a senator for just over a year, and the most common issue that is raised with me is jobs. And it is a tougher employment market, particularly where I live in central Queensland, in Rockhampton and surrounds. It's been difficult over the last few years given the downturn in the mining sector, and it's much harder for people to find work where they once could. I believe that one of our fundamental roles in this place, apart from defending the nation and managing the budget, is trying to give as many Australians as possible the dignity of work, trying to give as many people as possible the opportunity to have a job, to provide for their family and save up for their own home and be independent, not be dependent on welfare or dependent on others for help, but be independent, be their own boss in how they want to run their life. And unfortunately, there is a group of Australians right now who want to stop people from getting jobs. The biggest threat in central Queensland, where I live, is the rise of vigilante litigation by Green activists to shut down Australian industry and jobs. Activist litigation is on the increase. It's been one of our growth industries, unfortunately, over the past decade. And usually I'd be in favour of growth industries. I want to support growth, but not this particular growth industry. It's parasitic. And like all parasites, it only thrives by just trying to destroy its host. Our environmental laws mean that well-financed green groups and big environment groups get a bigger voice than ordinary Australians that actually live near coal mines and want the benefits of their development. Ordinary Australians like Les Bowles, who owns the Leo Hotel in Claremont. He employs 8 people at the moment at his pub, and he'd like to employ more. And he says if the Carmichael mine went ahead, he would be able to dramatically increase the number and provide more employment opportunities to locals. Les feels that the Claremont economy needs the boost that the Carmichael mine would create, and the recent court decision will negatively impact the small town's confidence and growth impacts. I want to give Les a voice. I think he deserves a voice in our nation's parliament, but right now, because we have a lawyers' picnic in this area, lawyers have a lot bigger voice than people like Les, unfortunately. And it's a very well organised picnic too, Mr Acting Deputy President. It is well organised because we know it's been a key tactic of green activist groups. They're not interested in protecting the environment. They might be called green, but they're not interested in protecting the environment. They're interested in shutting down the coal mining industry in Queensland and indeed across the country. We know it's an organised strategy, Mr Acting Deputy President, because their strategy document was, fortunately for us, leaked a few years ago. The full document was leaked. Stopping the Australian coal export boom was their particular strategy. It was supported by organisations like Greenpeace, GetUp, Lock the Gate, the New South Wales Environmental Defenders Office, the Mackay Conservation Group, the Australian Institute, and I can't believe this, but even a trade union was also involved in putting this document together, United Voice, a trade union, unions that are meant to be supporting jobs and supporting Australians being in work, but they want to shut down the coal mining industry too. This document was very explicit about its aim. It said, and I quote directly, "Our strategy is to disrupt and delay key projects and infrastructure while gradually eroding public and political support for the industry and continually building the power of the movement to win more." If they get their way, 50,000 Queenslanders will be out of work tomorrow, and tens of thousands more will miss out on the jobs that would have otherwise been created by new coal mining investments. This anti-development strategy is playing out right now in our country. Their strategy specifically mentions using the courts, not to improve the environment, but to stop mines. Again, directly quoting from their document, they say, the first priority is to get in front of the critical projects to slow them down in the approval process. This means lodging legal challenges to 5 new coal port expansions, 2 major rail lines, and up to a dozen of the key mines. This will require significant investment in legal capacity. While this is creating much needed breathing space, we need to continue to build the movement and mobilise to create pressure on politicians and investors alike. This is an abuse of our legal process, Mr Acting Deputy President. It is not about trying to protect the environment. It is about one specific aim, and that is to disrupt and delay investment in our economy and the creation of new jobs in our economy. And we saw that a couple of weeks ago, where a group, the New South Wales Environmental Defenders Office, who I'll come back to, they took an action in the federal court against the Carmichael coal mine in central Queensland, and they argued not that the mine would cause some terrible damage to the environment or threat to certain species. They argued that because the minister hadn't been shown all documents relating to a preservation order, relating to some threatened species, that the mine should be ruled, the approval should be ruled out of order. Now, there were approval conditions in this process for the ornamental snake and the yakka skink. There were conditions to protect them. They are two animals that are threatened, but they do have an area across a wide area of Queensland, not just in this particular coal mine. And the environmental groups didn't say the mine would necessarily cause them damage, didn't argue that at all. They just said because all of the documents weren't given to the minister, and there are hundreds of these pages of these documents, that it fell foul of section 139(2) of the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act because the minister hadn't had regard to the preservation orders for these threatened species. A ridiculous argument. An argument that was also used to stop an iron ore mine in Tasmania a few years ago that Senator Colbeck would know well. And this group, this New South Wales Environmental Defenders Office, they were the ones who took this action. They took an action against a coal mine it's sort of north of Claremont. It's out in the middle of nowhere really, but it's north of a little town called Alpha. Alpha is more than 1,500 kilometres away from Sydney. More than 1,500 kilometres, but they're the group that took this action. They're a group that receives over $3 million a year in revenue. They have 20 paid staff. They receive more than $1 million a year in donations from Australians, and the Australians that make those donations get tax deductions for doing so. So we are providing tax support for this abuse of our legal process, and I think that should end. And I won't go into detail here, but there's a House of Representatives inquiry into that process as well. I'd like to say that I support the government's announced proposal to toughen up the requirements to get legal standing in these cases. In almost every other area of law, if you want to get standing in a court, that is if you want to be given the right to take an action to try and stop a particular project, you need to have some interest, some appropriate legitimate interest in that particular project. I would argue that green lawyers in Sydney don't have a material interest in a coal mine near where I live that creates jobs there. They don't have a legitimate interest, and they should not be getting standing because under the way the current law is worded, they get it anyway. All you have to do is to be doing some kind of environmental work and you get standing. That is ridiculously too easy, and it should be changed. So I support the government's attempt to change section 4872 of the EPBC Act to ensure that only people actually affected by these coal mines get standing, and only them, they get the say. They get the say. The locals get to have the say. People who are impacted get the say. Now I can see the Labor Party senators already shaking their heads because we know who they're going to line up behind. We know they're going to line up behind the green activists and the lawyers in Sydney, not locals in central Queensland that need these jobs. That's their approach. But I think as a Queensland senator, I am going to be fighting hard for those jobs. I know my other fellow Queensland senators on this side of the chamber will be doing the same, and I wish other Queensland senators would do that too. But we already have a Queensland senator come out this morning. We only announced this proposal yesterday. Now this morning, unfortunately, Senator Lazarus from Queensland has already come out saying he opposes this particular change, that he doesn't think that people in Queensland deserve a bigger say than activist groups in Sydney. Now I know Senator Lazarus used to be quite an effective player for New South Wales. He used to cause quite a little bit of heartache to me as a Queensland supporter. He used to don the Blues jersey, and I think he might, Mr Acting Deputy President, still be a little bit confused. He still seems to be playing for the Blues, not the Maroons. He still seems to be supporting New South Wales ahead of Queensland because he is saying that green activist groups in Sydney deserve a bigger say than locals like Les Bowles and Kermott in his electorate who vote for him and put him in this place. And I would think that all senators would first want to put the interests of their state first, that the majority of Queenslanders support this coal mine, which will produce up to 10,000 jobs and massive amounts of opportunity, particularly for an area of the state that's struggling at the moment. I know all our Queensland senators do. It's unfortunate that somebody who was elected on a platform opposed to a mining tax, opposed to a carbon tax, ostensibly supporting our mining industry, is now going back on that promise and is instead supporting Greens in other states ahead of his own state. And I just ask Senator Lazarus to reconsider his position. He is a Queensland senator. He now should be donning the maroon, not the blue, and he should back Queensland in this instance because that is how we're going to get back on our feet after a slowdown in the mining sector. This is going to create jobs, and people should get behind this proposal to create jobs in Queensland.
Thank you, Senator Canavan.